After my graduation, I quietly moved my grandpa's $1 million estate into a trust just in case. On Sunday, my parents and sister showed up with movers, smiling and saying the house is in her name, now you're out, until they froze when they saw who was standing on the porch. The moment my parents smiled and told me to leave, I knew this wasn't about love. It was about timing. I had just graduated. My diploma was still warm in my hands when my sister stepped into my grandpa's living room like she already owned it and said almost cheerfully, "The house is in my name now. You should start packing." No shouting, no anger, just smiles like they were doing me a favor. What they didn't ask was what I had already done quietly, legally, and on purpose. They assumed I was still the same Harper who always stepped back, who swallowed discomfort to keep the peace, who never fought for space in her own family. So when they left that day, confident and relaxed, they thought the decision was final. They thought I would disappear the way I always had. They had no idea that weeks earlier, I'd made one move that would change everything. Especially the Sunday they came back with movers. Certain they'd already won. I learned how to take up less space long before I ever understood why I was doing it. In my family, love was never something you asked for. It was something you earned, or more accurately, something that landed where it pleased. My parents, Robert and Linda, would tell anyone who asked that they treated their daughters equally. And on paper, maybe they believed that, but in real life, equality dissolved in the small moments that never made it into family stories. My younger sister, Emily, had a way of filling every room without trying. If she was upset, the house adjusted around her mood. If she wanted something, it was discussed immediately, carefully, like a problem that needed solving. When I wanted something, the response was different. "Harper, you're mature. You understand," my mother would say, already half turned toward Emily. "You're independent," my father added. "You don't need as much." So, I learned not to need. I learned to nod when plans changed at the last minute. I learned to smile when Emily's achievements were celebrated louder, longer, with more pride. I learned to accept praise quietly and disappointment even more quietly. Over time, it became easier not to ask at all. Asking me hoping, and hoping usually led to being reminded why I shouldn't. From the outside, we looked fine. Weekend dinners, holiday photos, the kind of family neighbors described as close. But inside our house, attention moved in one direction, and I learned how to survive on the leftovers of it. I wasn't abused. I wasn't ignored completely. I was simply overlooked. And somehow that made everything harder to explain, even to myself. The only place where I didn't feel that way was my grandpa's house. George Miller lived in a small coastal town, in a house that never tried to impress anyone. The porch boards creaked in the same places every time. The air always smelled faintly of salt and pine. At night, you could hear the ocean if you listened closely, steady, and patient. When I was there, no one rushed me. No one compared me. No one told me I was too much or too little. My grandpa listened when I spoke, not politely, intentionally, like my words mattered simply because they were mine. As he got older, I started coming more often. At first, it was small things. Picking up groceries, driving him to appointments, helping sort mail. Later, it became more. Managing bills when he started forgetting dates, sitting with him on quiet afternoons when the house felt too still. I showed up not because anyone asked me to, but because it felt natural. Because in that house, I didn't have to earn my place. My parents and Emily visited too, but mostly for holidays or when something needed to be discussed. I noticed the difference, even if I didn't name it yet. I told myself families were complicated, that everyone showed love in their own way, that keeping the peace was worth the cost. By the time I finished school and walked across that graduation stage, my grandpa was gone, but his house remained the last place where I had ever felt fully seen. And I didn't yet realize how much that mattered or how quickly my family would try to take that feeling away from me. After my graduation, nothing changed right away, and that more than anything should have warned me. I stayed in my grandpa's house, telling myself I deserved a moment to breathe. I went back to work. I unpacked my boxes slowly. I tried to let the quiet settle without questioning it. But families like mine don't stay quiet for long, not when there's something to gain. The first question came from my mother. "So, Harper," she said one evening on the phone, her tone casual in a way that felt practiced. "Have you thought about what you're going to do with the house?" I remember standing in the kitchen, staring at the same spot on the counter while she spoke. She didn't ask how I was holding up. She didn't mention my graduation. Just the house. "I'm still figuring things out," I said carefully. "Well," she replied, "it's a lot of responsibility for one person. Property taxes aren't cheap. Maintenance either. We just worry about you. We just worry about you." It sounded kind, reasonable, almost loving, and if it had ended there, I might have believed it, but it didn't. A few days later, my father called. He wasn't as subtle. "You know, Harper," Robert said, clearing his throat the way he did when he thought he was being practical. "Your grandpa worked hard for that place. You don't want to get overwhelmed and make mistakes. What kind of mistakes? I asked. Oh, he said quickly, falling behind on payments, letting things slide. It would be a shame. A shame for whom? He didn't say. Then there was Emily. She started showing up without warning. Always with a reason that sounded harmless enough. Mom said she left a sweater here. I just wanted to grab something. I think I forgot. I was in the area. Each time she walked through the house like she was already memorizing it. Her eyes lingered on the hallway, the spare bedroom, the small desk where I kept paperwork stacked neatly but unsorted. You're still handling all the bills yourself? She asked one afternoon, leaning against the doorframe, smiling. Utilities, insurance, that kind of thing. I'm just curious. Just curious. I told myself not to read into it. I always did. Reading into things had never worked out well for me. In the past, it usually ended with someone telling me I was being dramatic. But the comments kept coming. It wouldn't be fair for one person to keep everything. I wouldn't. It will allow me. Your grandpa would have wanted it shared. We're family. Things should be simple. They used words like fairness and unity, wrapping each sentence in concern so neatly that pulling it apart felt almost rude. And for a while, I let it work. I smiled. I nodded. I gave non-answers that sounded cooperative without promising anything. Inside, though, something felt wrong. What finally cracked my denial wasn't a single conversation. It was a memory. Years earlier, I'd watched my parents borrow money from a relative for something they called temporary. They promised to pay it back quickly. When time passed and the topic came up again, the story shifted. The relative became difficult, ungrateful, obsessed with money. I remembered how easily the narrative flipped and how fast everyone agreed to forget the original promise. That night, I sat alone in the living room, listening to the house settle around me. I replayed every recent conversation, the timing, the smiles, the way concern always seemed to circle back to ownership. It didn't feel like coincidence anymore. It felt like preparation. For the first time in my life, I didn't push that feeling away. I didn't tell myself I was imagining things. I didn't try to be the easy one. Instead, I asked myself a question I'd never asked before. What if this time I didn't wait to see how bad it could get? And once that thought settled in, I realized something else. Something that made my stomach tighten with a strange mix of fear and clarity. If my family believed they were entitled to this house, they weren't going to ask forever. They were going to decide. The morning after that thought settled in, I took a long lunch break and didn't tell anyone where I was going. I dressed like it was a normal workday. Nothing that suggested fear or urgency. If anyone had asked, I would have said I was running errands. That was the first rule I gave myself. Nothing about my life would change on the surface. If my family thought I was standing still, they would move closer. And I needed them close enough to make a mistake. The law office was quiet, tucked between a dental clinic and a small accounting firm downtown. No flashy sign, no sense of drama, just a brass nameplate on the door that read Michael Turner, Estate and Trust Attorney. He didn't interrupt when I spoke. He didn't rush me. I told him everything. My grandpa, the house, my family, the sudden interest, the language they were using. I talked longer than I expected to. When I finally stopped, my throat felt tight, like I'd been holding my breath without realizing it. Michael leaned back in his chair and folded his hands. What you're describing, he said calmly, isn't uncommon. That sentence alone made me feel less alone than I had in weeks. He explained how situations like mine often unfolded. How families convinced themselves they were entitled to something simply because they decided it made sense. How delays and hesitation worked in favor of the people willing to push first and apologize later. If they believe the property belongs to them, he said, they won't wait for permission forever. He walked me through my options, not just what was possible, but what was realistic, what could be challenged, what couldn't, what created clarity and what created loopholes. When he explained an irrevocable trust, I listened carefully. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't fast. And once it was done, it couldn't be undone on a whim. The house, the remaining accounts, everything my grandpa had worked for could be placed somewhere it couldn't be quietly reinterpreted later. People assume silence means uncertainty, Michael said. In reality, it often means preparation. I didn't hesitate. The paperwork itself felt almost anticlimactic. No raised voices. No speeches about justice or betrayal. Just signatures, dates, and steady explanations of what each page meant. I asked questions. I took notes. I read everything twice. When it was finished, Michael slid a thin folder across the desk toward me. This doesn't look powerful, he said. But it is. I walked back out into the sunlight, feeling lighter and heavier at the same time. Lighter because I'd done something. Heavier because I knew there was no going back. Not just legally, but emotionally. I didn't tell my parents. I didn't warn Emily. I didn't change my tone when they called. I didn't shift my routines. I still answered messages. I still smiled at family dinners. I still played the role they expected. The quiet, accommodating Harper, who never caused problems. And they believed it. In fact, their confidence grew. Dinner invitations became more frequent. Conversations softened. My mother talked about family traditions like they were suddenly important again. My father mentioned how nice it would be if everyone could come together now that school was over. Emily joked about renovations she'd do if the house were ever hers, watching my face closely when she said it. I gave them nothing. No arguments, no reassurances, no promises. Behind the scenes, I started documenting everything. Dates, messages, the way questions were phrased. The assumptions slipped casually into conversation. I didn't confront them. I didn't need to. I just needed a clear record if they crossed the line. And eventually, they did. The first sign was an anger or accusation. It was urgency. My mother called one afternoon, her voice tight with something that sounded like concern, but carried an edge I hadn't heard before. "We need to talk soon," she said. "About the house. It can't wait." Minutes later, Emily texted, "We'll come by this weekend. It's easier to explain in person." I stared at my phone for a long moment before setting it face down on the table. By then, I knew exactly what they were planning. They thought my silence meant fear, that hesitation meant weakness, that because I had always stepped back before, I would do it again. They believed the decision was already made. I let them believe it. Because by the time they showed up smiling, certain and prepared, the real outcome had been sealed weeks earlier, and they were walking straight toward it. After that, my family became pleasant. Not warm, not loving, just deliberately pleasant, like people who believed the hard part was already over and were now waiting for cooperation to catch up. The change was subtle enough that if I described it to anyone else, it might have sounded like progress. To me, it felt like a warning. My mother started calling more often. Not to ask how I was doing. She'd never been good at that. But to reminisce. "Do you remember the summers we spent together?" she said one evening, her voice softer than usual. "We used to be such a close family." Close? I thought, meant quiet and compliant. My father followed with practicality disguised as concern. "You look tired lately, Harper. Are you managing everything okay out there by yourself?" Out there? As if the house wasn't mine? As if I were already temporary? Emily was the boldest. She stopped pretending her visits were accidental. She came by with coffee one afternoon and wandered through the house like a guest who'd overstayed long enough to feel entitled. "This room would make a great office," she said casually, glancing toward the spare bedroom and the porch. "I'd redo the railing, make it more modern." She watched my face closely when she spoke, searching for resistance. I gave her none. "That sounds nice," I said lightly. The relief on her face was instant and revealing. I realized then how much my silence was doing their work for them. They filled it with assumptions, with plans, with certainty. Every calm response I gave seemed to convince them they were right to move forward. Dinner invitations followed. More frequent, more insistent. "You should come by this weekend," my mom said. "Just the four of us." I went. I listened. I smiled. I played the version of myself they expected. The daughter who never pushed back. The sister who didn't compete. But I noticed everything. I noticed how conversations always circled back to logistics. How often Emily used the word "we." How my parents spoke in conclusions, not questions. "We'll need to think about insurance. We should probably update some records. It'll be easier once everything's in one name." One name, not mine. I wrote things down when I got home. Dates, phrases. The way my mother avoided looking at me when she said certain things. The way my father's tone shifted when I didn't immediately agree. The way Emily smiled a second too late, like she was rehearsing confidence rather than feeling it. At night, I walked through the house slowly, touching familiar things. Is the banister my grandpa had fixed himself? The small crack in the kitchen tile we always joked about. I told myself not to get sentimental. Sentiment made people careless. I needed to stay clear. The pressure increased quietly. "We really should settle this soon," my mom said during another call. "It's better for everyone," my dad added later. Better for everyone in my family's language usually meant easier for them. Then late Friday afternoon, the tone changed. My mother called, her voice tighter than before. "We need to talk," she said about the house. "It can't wait." Before I could respond, my phone buzzed with a text from Emily. "We LL come by Sunday. It's easier to explain in person." Explain, not discuss, not ask. I didn't respond right away. I set my phone down and stood in the kitchen, listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator. Outside, the ocean wind picked up, rattling the porch chime softly. The sound grounded me. By then, there was no confusion left in me, only clarity. They weren't coming to talk. They were coming to inform me. They believed silence meant surrender, that my calm meant agreement, that because I hadn't fought before, I wouldn't fight now. I let them believe it. On Saturday night, I barely slept. Not because I was afraid, but because my mind kept moving, replaying conversations, checking details, making sure every piece was where it needed to be. I laid out clean clothes. I set my phone to silent. I placed the important documents exactly where I could reach them. Sunday morning arrived gray and still, the kind of quiet that feels deliberate. I made coffee. I stood on the porch and watched the road waiting. Not to see if they would come, but to see how confident they would be when they did. Sunday morning arrived without drama. No storm, no sudden wind, just a flat gray sky stretched over the ocean like a held breath. I stood on the porch with a cup of coffee cooling in my hands, watching the road the way you watch something you already know is coming. I wasn't nervous. That surprised me. I felt steady, like everything that could be decided had already been decided, just not by them. The sound of tires crunching over gravel reached me before I saw the car. Then it appeared at the end of the drive, familiar and confident, followed by a second vehicle I didn't recognize. A moving truck. My grip tightened slightly on the cup, more out of disbelief than fear. So, this was how certain they were. Emily stepped out first, sunglasses on, smiling like this was a celebration instead of an eviction. My parents followed close behind her, standing shoulder to shoulder the way they always did when they believed they were united on the reasonable side of things. Emily didn't bother with small talk. "We got everything sorted," she said, holding up a neat stack of papers before I could even say hello. "The house is in my name now." My mother tilted her head, her voice softening immediately. "It's not personal, sweetheart. This is just what makes sense for the family." My father nodded, crossing his arms. "You have your life in the city, Harper. This place needs someone who can really manage it." Manage it? Like I hadn't been doing exactly that. I looked at the papers without reaching for them. Blue ink, crisp edges, seals that looked official enough at a glance. They'd done their homework or thought they had. "You'll need to be out by tonight," Emily added lightly, like she was reminding me to take leftovers home. There it was. Not a question, not a discussion, a verdict. For a moment, none of them spoke. They were watching my face, waiting for the reaction they expected. Confusion, panic, maybe tears, something that would confirm the version of me they had already decided on. Instead, I said one word. "Okay." The relief was immediate. Emily's shoulders dropped. My mother exhaled. My father's posture loosened like he just finished a difficult conversation successfully. "Good," my mom said quickly. "I knew you'd understand." Emily smiled wider. "I'll be back later with movers. It'll be easier if we handle everything at once." I nodded. I even stepped aside so they could pass me the way I always had. They left believing the hardest part was over. 2 days later, they came back. This time, the moving truck pulled all the way up the drive, loud and white against the muted sky. 2 movers jumped down, stretching, already looking at the house like it was just another job on the schedule. Emily was practically glowing. "This will go fast," she said, clapping her hands once. I'll have you out before lunch." My parents stood behind her, energized, confident, already talking logistics. "That couch should go first. Make sure you don't scratch the floors. Harper, you should start packing personal things." I stepped onto the porch. I wasn't alone. Standing beside me was Michael Turner. He looked exactly the same as he had in his office. Calm, composed, holding a thick folder under one arm. The kind of calm that doesn't argue or perform. The kind that waits. The movers slowed first. One of them hesitated mid-step, sensing the shift in the air. Emily's smile faltered. My parents exchanged a look. Michael stepped forward slightly. "I need to confirm who I'm speaking with," he said evenly. He listed their names without hesitation. My parents stiffened as he spoke them aloud like being identified suddenly mattered. "I'm here regarding the legal status of this property." My father frowned. "And you are?" Michael opened the folder just enough for them to see the documents inside. "I represent the local property records office," he said. "This house was transferred into an irrevocable trust several weeks ago. Harper is the sole trustee." The silence that followed was heavy, dense enough to press against my ears. Emily laughed first. It came out sharp and brittle. "That's not possible," she said quickly. "We have paperwork." Michael nodded once. "I've seen it." "Hey," could my mother step forward, confusion turning into irritation? "There must be a mistake. We corrected an error in the will." "There was no error," Michael replied calmly, "and any attempt to change ownership without authorization from the trustee is legally void." Emily's face drained of color. "That doesn't make sense," she said faster now. "Everything was filed properly." Michael flipped a page in his folder. "The filings were made through an unverified service. The notary information does not match state records. That alone invalidates the transfer." One of the movers cleared his throat. "So, should we wait?" Michael didn't take his eyes off my family. "No," he said. "You should not proceed." My father's voice hardened. "Are you accusing us of something?" "I'm stating facts," Michael replied. Emily turned to me then, eyes wide, voice tight. "You did this?" I met her gaze steadily. "I protected what wasn't yours to take." My mother's voice cracked. How could you do this to us after everything we've done for you? I didn't raise my voice. I didn't step closer. You showed up with movers, I said quietly. You told me I was out by tonight. You didn't ask. You decided. My father opened his mouth, then closed it again. The confidence he'd walked in with was gone, replaced by something thin and brittle. Michael handed him a copy of the notice. This documents today's attempted transfer and serves as a formal warning. He said any further attempts could escalate into a legal matter. The movers were already backing away, murmuring apologies. One climbed back into the truck without waiting for instructions. Emily stood frozen, the papers in her hand suddenly meaningless. This isn't over, she said weakly. I nodded once. That part is up to you. They didn't argue after that. They didn't threaten or plead or try to bargain. They just left. I watched their car disappear down the road, the moving truck following close behind. The gravel settled slowly back into place like nothing had happened at all. Michael closed his folder. They'll think twice before trying that again, he said. I thanked him and watched him drive away. Then I stood alone on the porch, the ocean still moving the way it always had. Nothing outside had changed, but everything inside me had. For the first time in my life, I wasn't bracing for what my family might take next. I was standing exactly where I belonged. After they left, the house felt unnaturally quiet. Not peaceful, at least not right away. The kind of quiet that settles after something heavy has passed through, leaving the air changed. I stayed on the porch for a long moment, listening to the sound of the moving truck fade into the distance, the gravel slowly settling back into place. No shouting, no slammed doors, no final speech, just absence. Inside, my phone buzzed once, then again. I didn't look at it immediately. For the first time, I didn't feel the urge to manage anyone else's emotions. Whatever they needed to say could wait. When I finally checked, there were messages from my mother and father. Short, restrained, carefully worded. We need to talk. This was unnecessary. You didn't have to involve outsiders. Outsiders. Not the law. Not the truth. Outsiders. I set the phone face down and walked through the house instead. The movers hadn't touched anything. Every room looked exactly the same. But it felt different now. The tension that had lived in the corners, the sense that this place was temporary, conditional, had lifted. I hadn't realized how tightly I'd been holding myself together until there was nothing left to brace against. Later that evening, another message came through. This one from Emily. You embarrassed us. You could have handled this privately. Privately, I thought, meant quietly giving in. I typed a response, then erased it, then typed another and erased that too. In the end, I didn't reply at all. Silence. I was learning. Wasn't surrender. It was a boundary. The next morning, Michael called. They didn't contest the notice, he said. That's usually a sign. A sign of what? I asked. That they understand their position, he replied, and that they don't like it. A few days later, a formal letter arrived from my parents' attorney. It was brief and stiff, withdrawing every claim connected to the property and requesting no further contact regarding the estate. No apology, no explanation, just retreat. I filed it away without ceremony. The fallout didn't explode the way I'd once imagined it might. There were no dramatic confrontations, no public arguments, no last-ditch attempts to guilt me into compliance. Instead, everything collapsed inward. The calls stopped first, then the messages, then the carefully curated concern disappeared altogether. Word traveled quietly after that. A distant aunt reached out with an awkward message about misunderstandings. A cousin asked vague questions without actually asking anything. Some relatives stayed silent and I let them. For the first time, I didn't chase the silence or try to fill it. I didn't explain myself. I didn't justify my choices. Anyone who wanted the full story could have asked me before showing up with movers. One afternoon, about a week later, I returned to my grandpa's house alone. I unlocked the door slowly, half expecting some new tension to be waiting inside. But there was nothing. Just the familiar smell of old wood and the faint lavender. My grandpa always kept tucked into drawers. I stood in the living room for a long moment and realized something that surprised me. I felt safe. Not relieved. Not victorious. Safe. For the first time in my life, I wasn't wondering what someone else might decide for me next. I wasn't waiting for permission to stay. The house wasn't a prize. I defended it was a boundary I'd drawn. And outside, the ocean kept moving. Steady and unconcerned. Exactly the way it always had. Time didn't rush back in the way I expected it to. After everything went quiet, I kept waiting for the next wave. Another confrontation. Another attempt. Another carefully worded message meant to reopen the door I'd finally closed. But it never came. Instead, the days stretched out, calm and unfamiliar, like a life I hadn't been trained to live in. At first, the silence felt heavy. I'd spent so many years anticipating my family's reactions that not having to do it anymore felt wrong, like I'd forgotten an important responsibility. Every time my phone buzzed, my body reacted before my mind did. Shoulders tightening, breath-catching, until I realized it wasn't them. They were gone. Not dramatically, not angrily, just absent. A few weeks later, I heard through a relative that my parents were taking space. That was the phrase they used. Not we crossed a line. Not we were wrong. Just space. As if this were mutual, temporary, something that would resolve itself if left alone long enough. Emily didn't reach out at all. That hurt more than I expected. Not because I missed her, but because it confirmed something I'd always suspected. Our relationship had never been about connection. It had been about access. And once access was gone, so was the relationship. I stopped trying to make sense of it after that. Instead, I focused on the house. I went through drawers slowly, deciding what to keep and what to let go. I found old notes my grandpa had written to himself, grocery lists, reminders, half-finished thoughts. In one drawer, I found a folded piece of paper with my name written on it in his careful handwriting. It wasn't a will or instructions, just my name written once, like he wanted to remember something important. That small thing stayed with me. I made changes to the house, but only gentle ones. I fixed what needed fixing. I kept what mattered. I didn't renovate or erase him. I let the place breathe the way it always had. With distance came clarity. I realized that what my family had wanted wasn't the house itself. It was control. The house was just the excuse. And when I'd taken control away quietly, legally, without spectacle, they had nothing left to stand on. There were moments of doubt, of course, late nights when old habits whispered that maybe I'd gone too far, that maybe I should have handled it softer. Those thoughts never lasted long. Because every time they surfaced, I remembered the moving truck, the papers, the certainty on their faces when they told me to leave. Boundaries aren't cruelty. I reminded myself their clarity. Slowly, my body learned what my mind already knew, that I wasn't in danger anymore, that no one was coming to take something from me while I slept, that the space I occupied was mine by right, not by permission. I started making plans that didn't involve managing anyone else's expectations. I spent weekends at the house without feeling watched. I invited friends over without rehearsing explanations. I let myself exist without shrinking. And in that space, quiet, steady, unclaimed, I understood something my grandpa had shown me all along. Belonging isn't something you beg for. It's something you protect. On a Sunday afternoon, not long after everything finally settled, I unlocked my grandpa's front door and stepped inside alone. The house smelled the same old wood, clean air, and the faint trace of lavender he used to tuck into drawers without telling anyone. Sunlight slid across the floor in familiar patterns, unhurried, like it didn't care how much had changed outside these walls. I moved through each room slowly, not out of caution this time, but out of respect. There was no tension in my shoulders, no instinct to listen for footsteps behind me. For the first time, I wasn't waiting for someone to challenge my right to be there. I made tea and sat on the porch, watching the tide move in and out. The ocean hadn't changed. The house hadn't changed. What had changed was me. For most of my life, I believed that keeping the peace meant staying quiet, that being loved meant being easy, that protecting myself would somehow make me the problem. I know now how wrong that was. Drawing a boundary doesn't mean you stop caring. It means you stop disappearing. The trust did exactly what it was meant to do. It created clarity. It removed ambiguity. It protected something that mattered. Not just a house, but the last place where I'd ever felt fully seen. And in doing so, it taught me something my grandpa understood long before I did. Security isn't the absence of conflict. It's the presence of boundaries that hold. I didn't win anything that day. I didn't take something from anyone else. I simply refused to let something be taken from me again. If you've ever felt pressured to give up your space, your voice, or your safety just to keep the peace, know this. You're not selfish for protecting yourself. You're not dramatic for saying no. And you're not alone for choosing clarity over comfort. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is make one quiet, legal, irreversible decision and let it speak for you.